So, imagine Golden Lotus. Not just a restaurant, but a whole temple of luxury. Crystal chandeliers playing in the subdued light, heavy curtains shutting out the bustle of the outside world, and waiters whose poise and impeccable uniforms would make the strictest military men envious. Arthur, a waiter whose self-confidence bordered on arrogance, stood out among this solemn atmosphere. He looked at visitors as if they were exhibits, evaluating them from head to toe and passing judgment based on the brand of clothing and the glitter of jewelry. For Arthur, the world was divided into worthy and not so worthy, and he considered himself an expert on the subject. And so, in this oasis of pathos, one evening, walks in Keanu Reeves. Yes, the same one, but not dressed like a movie star. A simple t-shirt, jeans, ordinary shoes, not a hint of Hollywood glamour. He behaves quietly, even inconspicuously, like an ordinary visitor who happened to drop by. The irony of the situation, of course, did not escape my observant eye. In this room, where every ostentatious element screamed of status, Keanu's modesty seemed almost indecent. Arthur, noticing this unconventional guest, immediately fixed him on his unworthy list. His eyebrows went up, and a contemptuous smile played on his lips. At this moment, tension seemed to hang in the air. It seemed as if something interesting was about to happen. So, our hero, Keanu, is sitting at a table, and Arthur swims up to him leisurely, like a peacock on a walk. On Arthur's face, a kind of contrived politeness, like a used car salesman. He says, "Good evening," but his tone is like he's doing a favor. He looks closely at Keanu, scanning his simple shirt, the absence of any talking brands, and there's contempt in Arthur's eyes, as if he's looking at a stain on an expensive tablecloth. "Did you choose something?" he asks, as if he doubts that Keanu even has money for anything other than a glass of water. Arthur starts making barbs, either in jest or not. "I guess you'd be better off with something simpler, from the menu of the day," he says. He says this as if Keanu has accidentally wandered into the temple of haute cuisine and it's time for him to leave. Keanu, however, in response to these compliments, only smiles slightly and replies with surprising calmness, "I'm still looking around, thank you." This seems to irritate Arthur even more. He is apparently used to his wit causing either embarrassment or apologies, but here he is completely unperturbed. The dialogue develops like ping-pong on one side and a wall on the other. "I hope you realize we have a certain level here," Arthur continues. "Not everyone can afford it." Keanu, instead of being offended or indignant, calmly replies, "I understand that every establishment has its own rules." But Arthur doesn't stop. He's getting more and more upset, like a little steam train that's picked up speed. He glances at Keanu's clothes, at his modest watch, and his voice becomes more and more sarcastic. The tension builds, like a thunderstorm. Arthur circles his prey like a predator, while Keanu remains motionless, but there is a scrutiny in his eyes that would probably embarrass anyone. The contrast is obvious. Pompous Arthur, confident in his rightness and his insight, and calm Keanu, who seems to observe this clowning with a condescending smile. Arthur is not just rude, he shows his complete incompetence, not realizing that a man's true worth is not measured by his clothes. Something more lurks behind this mask of unassumingness, and it is about to make itself known. The tension in the air was thickening like a thick fog before a thunderstorm. Arthur continued his monologue about the unworthy guests, his voice ringing with false confidence. His rage, like overripe fruit, burst forth, and now he was no longer shy in his expressions, allowing himself to make crude personal attacks on Keanu. His face contorted, his cheeks burning, his eyes flashing with lightning. He seemed to revel in his impunity, reveling in his own importance. Keanu, who had remained calm until then, stopped smiling. His face became as cold as ice, and his gaze as sharp as a razor blade. Without raising his voice, he responded to Arthur's insults with short but forceful sentences, each one sounding like a hammer blow. Arthur, as if blinded by his own pride, did not notice the change, continuing to hurl insults like peas from a holy sack. It was like he was trying to prove his worth by humiliating someone who didn't return the favor. It was like a small dog barking at a huge lion, not realizing how ridiculous he was in his aggression. And now, confident in his invulnerability, Arthur uttered a phrase that crossed all the boundaries of what was allowed, a rude, sarcastic outburst that cut the ears of even the most imperturbable visitors. At that moment, it became clear that Keanu's calmness had reached its limit, and the situation was about to get out of control. Tension reached its peak. The air seemed to be able to be cut with a knife. Everyone froze in anticipation of what would follow this latest, unforgivable rudeness. And then, when it seemed that nothing could surprise, history had another surprise in store. And now, Keanu's calm, which until then had seemed unshakable, like a taut string, was about to burst. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a steely note in his tone. "I suppose I need to speak to the manager," he said, not taking his eyes off Arthur. The latter, of course, took it as another weakness, as a confirmation of his own rightness. "Yes, of course, I'll call you right away," he replied, grinning mockingly, showing that he wasn't afraid of this conversation. And then the manager appeared, Mr. Smith, a man who seemed to know everything and anything about the restaurant. But his confidence, his smoothness, vanished as soon as he saw Keanu. Mr. Smith's eyes widened in surprise, then a flash of fright. He literally froze in place, as if struck by lightning. Mr. Reeves?" he whispered, stammering. "Is it you?" He couldn't find the words to express his amazement. It was then that Arthur, who had been smirking smugly, began to realize that something was going wrong. His face stretched, and his confidence evaporated like morning fog. "Mr. Reeves?" he asked again, and for the first time there was doubt in his voice. Mr. Smith, gathering his wits, hastened to remedy the situation. "Arthur, you don't seem to be aware of it. Mr. Reeves is the owner of this establishment." There was a silence so thick it seemed to be touchable. Arthur looked at Mr. Smith and Keanu, as if petrified. His face showed a whole range of feelings: bewilderment, shock, horror, and finally, realization of the depth of his mistake. He tried to say something, but all he got out of his throat was a mumble. He realized that he had insulted his employer, and not just any employer, but a man whom, judging from Mr. Smith's reaction, everyone here respected. In that silence, broken only by the whispers of surprised visitors, Keanu spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Arthur," he began, looking directly into the waiter's eyes, "appearances are deceiving, and a man's true worth is not in his clothes, but in his actions." There was no malice or reproach in his words, only wisdom and a slight sadness. The irony of the situation was obvious. An arrogant waiter, who judged people by their clothes, insulted someone who, as it turned out, was superior to him in all respects. But this is not the end of the story, because there are things that cannot be left unattended. And so, when the tension peaked, Keanu, instead of the expected anger, just looked at Arthur. There was no anger in his eyes, just a slight disappointment. "Arthur," he said calmly, "I think you and I have misunderstood each other." Arthur's face, already pale with the realization of his folly, turned even whiter. He was ready to fall through the ground, but Keanu went on, his voice remaining soft but firm. "You know," he said, "clothes, expensive watches, big names are just a wrapper. The real value of a man is inside, in his actions, in his attitude toward others." Arthur was silent, as if the words were stuck in his throat. He finally realized what a huge blunder he had made, how superficially he had judged a man based only on his appearance. Shame came over him in waves, and the thought swirled around in his head. How could he have been so presumptuous? Keanu, seeing his remorse, continued, "I'm not going to fire you, Arthur, but I want you to understand one simple thing. Respect should be shown to everyone, no matter how they dress or what they do. Kindness and consideration is what really matters. Arthur pulled himself together and muttered an apology, his voice shaking with excitement. He promised that he would never again allow himself to judge people by their cover. Keanu nodded, accepting his apology. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, giving way to lightness and even some hope. Just like that, in one wise lesson, Keanu had shown that true strength lay not in status, but in kindness and humility. He stayed true to himself, still as modest and unassuming, but now everyone knew who he really was. And this lesson was not in vain. It left a trace in the hearts of all who witnessed this story. This story makes us think about how often we are wrong, making hasty conclusions. And what happened next, you ask? Well, that's for another time.